There was a time when I believed the greatest mysteries in life existed somewhere beyond me. I imagined they lived inside distant places, extraordinary people, or experiences I had not yet encountered. I thought understanding was always waiting on the other side of another achievement, another conversation, another year of becoming. It never occurred to me that the most unfamiliar thing I would ever meet was the person I had been carrying within me all along. There is a quiet assumption most of us inherit without ever questioning it. We believe that because we wake up with the same memories, the same habits, and the same name every morning, we know who we are. Familiarity becomes evidence. Repetition becomes identity. We mistake continuity for understanding simply because nothing appears different on the surface, but familiarity is not the same as awareness. You can spend years inside the same house without ever opening every door. The strange thing about identity is that it rarely hides from us. It hides behind us, not because it is difficult to find, but because we spend so much of our attention looking outward that we never think to turn around and observe the observer himself. We become experts at reading other people. We notice subtle changes in someone's voice. We recognize disappointment before they speak it. We detect confidence, hesitation, affection, distance. Yet the person whose inner world remains most invisible is often the one whose thoughts we inhabit every single day, ourselves. That contradiction fascinated me long before I understood it. How could the mind that analyzes everything remain blind to the structure that produces every thought it has ever created? The answer, I think, is surprisingly simple. The eye cannot directly observe itself. It requires reflection, not explanation, reflection. There is a profound difference between those two words. Explanation gathers information, reflection rearranges perception. Most people spend their lives collecting explanations. Why they behave the way they do, why certain events happened, why they succeeded, why they failed. Every answer becomes another piece of a carefully organized story. The problem is that stories are comforting. Reality rarely is. A story protects identity, reflection questions it, and questioning yourself is one of the most uncomfortable experiences a human being can voluntarily choose, because every sincere question carries an invisible possibility. The possibility that the person asking it may not like the answer. That is why certainty becomes so attractive. Not because certainty is always true, because certainty allows us to stop looking. The moment we decide we already understand ourselves, curiosity quietly disappears, and with curiosity goes growth. I've begun wondering whether self-deception is rarely intentional. Perhaps it is simply efficient. The human mind prefers stability. It builds routines because routines require less energy. Eventually, those routines extend beyond behavior. They become perception itself. You stop noticing what you've seen every day. You stop questioning beliefs you've repeated often enough. You stop examining emotions that have become familiar companions, not because they are accurate, because they are predictable. Predictability creates comfort. Comfort creates blindness. There is something deeply ironic about that. The very mechanisms designed to make life easier slowly make perception less accurate. We begin seeing expectations instead of reality, patterns instead of possibilities, conclusions instead of observations. Then one ordinary day something unexpected happens, not dramatic, not life-changing in the way stories usually describe. Someone asks a simple question. A quiet moment interrupts your routine. A sentence stays in your thoughts longer than it should. Nothing extraordinary occurs except one thing. For the first time in years, your automatic understanding hesitates. That hesitation is more significant than it appears. We usually think certainty creates intelligence. I'm beginning to suspect the opposite. Perhaps intelligence begins the moment certainty pauses long enough for observation to return. Observation is remarkably humble. It makes no claims. It reaches no conclusions. It simply watches. Children understand this naturally. Everything fascinates them because nothing has yet become ordinary. Adults experience the opposite. Everything appears ordinary because almost nothing is observed with fresh attention anymore. We no longer see. We recognize. Recognition is useful. Observation is transformative. One preserves the past. The other discovers the present. I didn't appreciate that distinction until I noticed how much of my life had been guided by assumptions I had never consciously chosen. I believed certain things because they had always seemed true. I reacted certain ways because I always had. I protected parts of myself without remembering when they first needed protection. Every habit carried a history. Every certainty carried an origin. Yet I had mistaken both for personality. Perhaps identity is less solid than we imagine, not fragile, fluid. Like water taking the shape of whatever container quietly surrounds it. Environment influences us. Language influences us. Expectations influence us. The remarkable part is that most of this happens beneath awareness. Long before we decide who we are, countless invisible experiences have already begun deciding what feels normal. Normal is one of the most powerful words in human psychology, not because it describes reality, because it quietly limits imagination. Anything outside normal feels uncomfortable, not necessarily wrong, simply unfamiliar, and unfamiliarity often disguises itself as danger. That realization changed the way I looked at fear. I used to think fear warned us about genuine threats. Now I wonder how often fear is simply protecting an outdated version of ourselves. Growth almost always feels unfamiliar before it feels natural, which means discomfort cannot automatically be trusted as evidence that something is wrong. Sometimes discomfort is only announcing that an old identity has reached the edge of its usefulness, that thought stayed with me, because if identity can become outdated. It arrived quietly, the way most meaningful truths do, not as certainty, as recognition, and once recognition begins, it rarely stops where you expect it to. Recognition has a peculiar quality. It never arrives as loudly as certainty once did. Instead, it quietly replaces it. One day you realize that the questions which once demanded immediate answers no longer feel urgent. Not because they have been solved, but because you've begun seeing that some questions exist not to be answered, but to reshape the person asking them. That realization altered something fundamental in me. For years, I believed self-knowledge meant collecting accurate descriptions of who I was. I wanted definitions, personality, strengths, weaknesses, values, motivations. I imagined identity as something that could eventually be completed. Like finishing a map where every unexplored territory had finally been named. Now I wonder whether the map was never meant to be finished. Perhaps the moment we believe we fully understand ourselves is the very moment we stop becoming. Life has a remarkable way of exposing the limitations of every identity we become too attached to, not by destroying it, by quietly placing us inside situations where it no longer explains our experience. What once felt certain suddenly feels incomplete. The beliefs that carried us through one chapter become strangely insufficient for the next. At first, we resist, not because we are unwilling to grow, because growth often feels like betrayal. It feels as though we are abandoning the person we've spent years learning to become, but perhaps nothing is being abandoned. Perhaps something is simply expanding beyond its previous borders. I've noticed that rivers never apologize for changing direction. The sky does not seek permission before becoming something entirely different with the changing seasons. Only human beings believe they must remain identical to the person they were yesterday in order to remain authentic. Maybe authenticity has never been about consistency. Maybe it has always been about honesty. Honesty asks a difficult question, not who have I been, but who am I becoming now? Those are not the same inquiry. The first protects memory. The second welcomes transformation. Most of us spend extraordinary amounts of energy preserving old conclusions. We revisit familiar stories because they reassure us that we remain understandable to ourselves. There is comfort in repetition, but there is also confinement. Eventually, the stories we use to explain ourselves become walls that prevent us from meeting newer versions waiting quietly beyond them. The strange thing is that no one notices the prison while it still feels familiar. You leave behind explanations that once felt permanent, yet nothing equally solid has appeared to replace them. For a while, you simply exist between two understandings. That space is uncomfortable, but it is also sacred. Every meaningful transformation passes through it. We are taught to fear uncertainty, yet uncertainty is often the birthplace of perception. Only a mind willing to admit it does not fully know can truly begin seeing what has always existed beyond its assumptions. I think this is why humility feels so powerful, not because it makes us smaller, because it removes the illusion that we have already reached the end of understanding. The universe is endlessly expanding. Why should consciousness be any different? Perhaps the greatest mistake we make is assuming that self-awareness has a destination, as though one day we will finally arrive and say, "Now I know myself completely." Every layer of awareness reveals another beneath it. Every answer creates a more refined question, not because truth keeps changing, because perception keeps deepening. Imagine standing before the ocean for the first time. From a distance it appears simple, blue water meeting the horizon. Step closer and waves appear, closer still and currents become visible. Dive beneath the surface and an entirely different world has been waiting there all along. The ocean never changed, your proximity did. Perhaps the same is true of ourselves. The deeper our attention becomes, the less familiar we appear, not because we are becoming strangers, because we are finally meeting what familiarity had hidden. That thought changed the meaning of silence for me. I used to fill silence with explanations. Now I allow it to reveal what words usually interrupt. Silence has an unusual honesty. It exposes the thoughts we habitually outrun. It reveals desires we never admitted. It uncovers fears disguised as ambition. It introduces us to versions of ourselves that noise politely keeps concealed. There is a reason so many people avoid being alone with their own thoughts. Not because solitude is empty, because it is astonishingly full. Within that quiet exists every unanswered question we've postponed, every possibility we've dismissed, every truth we've sensed without having the courage to acknowledge. Eventually, however, avoidance becomes exhausting, noticing becomes easier than pretending, and perhaps that is the true beginning of wisdom, not possessing greater knowledge, possessing greater willingness to remain honest with what knowledge reveals. I no longer believe the purpose of life is to become someone entirely different. I think its purpose may be far quieter than that, to remove, little by little, every illusion separating us from the person we have always been beneath. Fear, expectation, and certainty. Maybe self-discovery is a misleading phrase. Nothing essential was ever lost. Nothing essential needed to be created. It only needed to be recognized. Recognition, I return to that word once again because it demands no performance, no reinvention, no dramatic declaration, only attention, patient, undistracted, honest attention. Perhaps that is the rarest quality in the modern world, not intelligence, not ambition, attention, because whatever receives sustained attention quietly becomes visible. And whatever becomes visible can no longer remain unconscious. That is both the gift and the burden of awareness. Once you truly see yourself, you lose the comfort of pretending to be someone else. The old explanations continue existing, but they no longer convince you. The familiar habits continue calling your name, but they no longer feel like home. Something inside has shifted too deeply to return unchanged. People often ask when transformation begins. I think they're asking the wrong question. Transformation begins long before we notice it. The real question is when we finally become honest enough to recognize that it has already happened. Maybe that moment is not dramatic. Maybe no one else notices it. Maybe the world continues exactly as it always has, but inside you, something irreversible has quietly taken place. The person searching for themselves has disappeared, not because they found every answer, because they finally stopped searching everywhere except the one place where the truth had patiently waited from the very beginning, themselves.